Good morning and welcome to another webinar Wednesday with the First Nations Public Service Secretariat. My name is Selena Dorme. I'm the Manager of Engagement and Capacity here at FNPSS. I'm also a member of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation in North Vancouver, and I'm joining you today from the FNPSS offices in West Van on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So thank you so much for taking some time out of your morning to join us. Today's webinar, my screen just disappeared on me, is we're going to be talking about the power of our data and the ways in which these stories we can tell open doors to new ways of seeing. So we have a few different speakers here today, which you can see on my screen. We're going to start off with Byron Flekke from Statistics Canada, and then we will move on to Robert Harding from the University of Fraser Valley, and then we will move on to Len Garis from the National Indigenous Fire Safety Council. They will each speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will move into our Q&A session. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Byron to get started.
Thank you, Selena. Good morning, everybody. My name is Byron Flekke. I'm Statlium, and I'm in Kwantlen territory. So Kwantlen is just north of me, and nearby is Catesy, and then to the east are Matsqui, and to the west is Semiahmoo. And this is not my territory, but this is where I'm living, so I'm coming at you live from someone else's territory right now. And I have a presentation deck that I am going to show you in 1 second here. This is a deck that was adapted from an original draft I had. I was going to deliver it to a youth conference pre-COVID. So now it's a deck for youth of all ages. I'm quite proud of that line. My wife thinks I'm a bit of an idiot for being so excited about the opportunity to make that joke, but that's okay. The way I picked this title is actually from a conversation with my co-presenter, Robert. He said to me one time that data was like a poem. You have to do something with it. You have to bring it to life, and there's no point to it if you don't do anything with it. So I'm going to attempt to do that here. First of all, a bit of a disclaimer for everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm an idiot, so I do and say stupid things. And just for example, the last time I saw my foster mom in person before COVID, I told her she had lived too long. A second disclaimer here is that I take something of a psychoanalytical approach to life. I hope you know what that means. That's right. It means I'm obsessed with perversion. Now that sounded way better in my head than it looks on a giant screen. Where I'm going with this, or trying to anyway, is that this is perhaps a presentation on identity as much as it is about anything else or anything in particular. When I say identity, I don't mean simply a dictionary definition from a survey. An indicator isn't an identity, and they aren't designed that way. There's identity, and then there's...
I'm very sorry to interrupt, but are you speaking to slides at the moment, or you haven't started sharing yet? Because we can't see your slides.
It didn't show.
No, so let's try that again.
Let's try that again. I'm so sorry. Starting over. Is it showing now?
No.
Oh, you know what?
We just got it to work during our practice session, so bear with us.
Let's do this.
There we go.
Now it'll work. Okay.
Yeah. So now we can see your desktop. Oh,
and how about now?
Good to go.
Oh,
Great.
It's working. Okay. All right. So starting over. I'll burn through that so you can see what the slides were that I was talking about. So it's adapted from an original draft that I was going to deliver at the youth conference pre-COVID, and now it's a deck for youth of all ages. I am quite proud of that still, even though it's the second time I've made that joke today. But my wife does think I'm an idiot for being excited about it. I picked this title after a conversation with Robert, my co-presenter, where he said to me that data was like a poem. You have to do something with it, and you have to bring it to life. So there's no point to it if you don't do anything with it. You can't just have it sitting there unused. So first, the disclaimer that we all know now, but I'll remind you that I am an idiot. I may remind you throughout of this, and we'll see. But I do say stupid things. For example, the last time I saw my foster mom in person before COVID, I told her she had lived too long. Um, I have a second disclaimer, and that's that I take something of a psychoanalytical approach to life. And I hope you all know what that means. That's right. It means I'm obsessed with perversion. And that sounded better in my head. And it still looks pretty funny on the screen. So I'll leave it there for another half second. Where I'm going with this is that I'm trying to say this is perhaps a presentation on identity as much as it is about anything else or anything in particular. When I say identity, I don't mean simply a dictionary definition from a survey. An indicator isn't an identity, and they aren't designed that way. There's identity, and then there's self-identification. The saying is, I think, you either are or you ain't. I are. So behind each indicator, there's a much larger story playing out. Identity is who you are, and we never really know someone else because we can't. Now, we think we can, and sometimes we think we do, but we don't really. We can only try to know ourselves. And so I'm going to talk therapy a bit here. Not for long, don't worry, it's just to introduce an idea to you. I'm excited to talk about talk therapy, but for you, I guess this will be more of a listen therapy. I was very happy to come across this idea of psychoanalysis in George Manuel's The Fourth World, an Indian Reality. This is one of my favorite books, and it's one of my top books I recommend when people ask me, what should I read, Byron? And I say, this is the one. I thought when I came across psychoanalysis in the book, I thought, here we go. My Indian half and my white half are coming together. There's something familiar between his grandfather and some of my understanding of the world and myself. And I'll remind people that I'm Statly, I'm here, I'm not Secwepemc, so I'm not pretending to be from another area. So what I'm going to introduce is this idea that, and we'll see if it makes sense. So I'm going to borrow from a guy named Adam Phillips. You'll see his book on the right there. I love him. He's got great books. He's a great writer. And this book is called Missing Out in Praise of the Unlived Lives, the unlived life. So without getting too far into it, I just want to introduce to you to the idea that your lived experiences, what you would call your life, is at once your lived life and all your unlived lives too. So all of these make up who you are, your identity, if you will. And then to build on a previous slide, your identity then is who you are and who you aren't at the same time. Any fantasy you have about what could have been, that's a powerful force, and you either honor it or you don't. If we don't honor them, we risk letting them control us and define us, and I think honoring them is just all around more healthy. Similarly, related to this, we have word choice. Now, the words we choose matter, and the words we don't choose matter too. And in fact, each word we choose carries with it every word we didn't use in its place. Now, remember when I said I was obsessed with perversion? So I did that on purpose, and let's see where this goes. So these two ideas are in your mind, and I'm going to leave them there, and then we'll go somewhere entirely different. There's this concept called potential years of life lost. Sounds kind of cool, right? Maybe a little ominous. So I don't want to ruin it here because I'm not a data person exactly. I'm not an analyst, but a quick sort of summary is that you can calculate the average life expectancy of someone and subtract that from that number, the age at which they actually die. And this difference gives you what I'll refer to as the pill on the screen there. Now, this is where my mom comes back into the story. So see, this is my foster mom I'm talking about here. She raised me since I was just under 2 years old. She's probably the best thing that's ever happened to me. And she was always there for a good story and a good quote. So that's her, my white mom, Bonnie. We had a lot of great conversations last time I was out there. She asked me, Byron, I've had a long life, haven't I? And I said, Bonnie, you definitely have. Now, this is where the power of data comes in. I knew exactly the concept I could take and use to enhance my mother's experiences in life. I don't know that she needed more enhanced experiences. She took care of my siblings and I, so it's probably enough. But my gears were already turning at that point, and they were going full speed. And I was trying to find a way to translate my knowledge and wisdom, expertise to my mother, so I could answer her question, right? And so this is what I consider a big brain move. I said, "Listen, mother, I recently learned of this concept, and I think it will help show you exactly how long your life has been." I explained the idea. And I said, we normally say 84 is the estimated age for your demise. In Canada, that's what women can expect. It's a pretty good guess. But I had to explain that we aren't using this concept in its normal use. Remember what I said, it's big brain stuff at work here. So we're using it to demonstrate something else. You see, my mom survived quite a few incidents that could have easily resulted in her death. And we always joke together about her 9 lives. So I said, let's take your age, 78 at the time. Now, when was the first time you were about to die? And so she said, negative .2. And I said, what? That's not possible. How could that be? So she was born premature. She said she fit in the palm of a hand, and nobody thought that she would make it. So that's when I realized if we're starting at negative .2, but we're going to need a chart because charts are super helpful. So bam, I created this chart for her. Premature, an accident. What she remembered from that was that somebody had to use one of those bags to help breathe for her. And she mentioned she thought it was one of her brothers, but she had a really large family. She said that was because they were Catholic. So I'm going to leave it at that. So the ages that these incidents occurred are on the left. And the breast cancer series is interesting here. She asked for, at the first time it happened, she asked if they could remove her breast. And they said, nope, that's not necessary. And then it came back. And then they removed it. And then she asked, can you remove my other one as a preventative measure? The data doesn't look too good for me. And they told her, absolutely not. That would be considered cosmetic surgery. And so anyway, the ending is already spoiled for you. You can see it there. It came back again. Now, breast cancer is quite common. This reminds me of another story, actually. When I was in high school, I had a friend, and he was missing a pec. And so we became sort of like bros because I was missing a pec too. And his was removed because he had cancer, and mine just never developed. I don't know if it was left behind or if it just sort of like when it came time to show up, it just instinctively knew that like I was so powerful with one pec, it wouldn't be fair to everybody else to give me a second one. But according to the doctor, it had more to do with fetal alcohol than it did with me being super powerful. I think that's still up for debate though. But what I will always remember is the doctor bringing in other doctors from the practice to show off my missing pec and have them touch my missing pec because it was so rare. According to them, it was rare because I didn't have any of the cognitive features or indicators, but I had some physical features. And so anyways, breast cancer is quite common, as we can see here. So there I was, I had this nifty chart going, and I replaced the almost cause of death with the amount of years lived since it happened. And that's what we had on the right there. And so then I added it all up, and voila, 220.2 years on this planet. That's like a lot. That's a lot. So I reminded her of the average guesstimate around A4, and I said, so if we look at this using the pill metric, we see that were she to die from an accident right at that moment, it would be 6 years of 6 potential years of life lost. But I'm not really one for following the rules, as I've said. So I dropped a big or in here while I was explaining it, and like no kidding, I mean like a font size 350 or. And I reframed the approach for what I think is a much more positive outlook. I told her, if you feel old, that's probably why. You've had 142.2 bonus years on this planet, and we were able to share those. So that's sort of the story about how I told my mom she had lived too long, but it isn't the whole story. There's a backstory to how I could be capable of being such an idiot. The way I ended up with my white mom is part of a larger story here, and it's a story spanning the country and time. And at the heart of this narrative is the children. So the violence of language is a common theme in this larger narrative. Earlier, I mentioned how important word choice is, and we'll take a look now at some examples where the words we use, intentionally or not, are violent. We'll explore this first by turning to something that's comfortably called the 60s scoop. Now, the term 60s scoop, it is a bit misleading. It's a great term, don't get me wrong. It sort of captures the essence of what was happening on one side at the time. And it has a catchy way about it. And that's why Patrick Johnson put it in his 1983 report, Native Children in the Child Welfare Program. But when I think about this and when I consider how it's used, I'm not very happy. First of all, it implies it happened during the 60s. And that allows you to think that it only happened during the 60s. But in fact, there are, legally speaking, 40 years represented with this phrase. And 9 of those were before the 60s. So this is, in its present use, incredibly misleading. And underlying all this is the assumption that it stopped or things have changed in a significant way. Popular phrases pop up like epidemic, sentences like there's an epidemic of Aboriginal or Indigenous children in child welfare systems. Epidemics are rapid spreading of a disease in a short span of time with infections in a certain demographic. We're currently in a pandemic, which is sort of the same thing, but on a larger scale, and it's worldwide instead of just in one place. But this isn't a disease. This isn't something that's out of control that we just respond to. This is done by choice, isn't it? And it's done by people. And someone created policies, and someone implemented those into practice. And then people continue to implement those into practice today. So the word epidemic doesn't really fit. It's comfortable though, isn't it? It reminds me of this quote from a guy named Gordon Livingston, where he said, every snowflake in an avalanche pleads not guilty. And if that's the case, then the settlement agreement agrees. So I suggest you remember this phrase. The 60s here actually runs from 1951 to 1991, and I was born in 1983, so I'm in here. This is, after all, a part of the story of how I met my white mom. You remember Patrick, who wrote our catchy catchphrase into existence? He pointed out that by 1977, an estimated 15,500 Indigenous children were in care across Canada at the time. So far in the settlement process, and these numbers are from last month, but they received 34,770 claims, and they've approved 15,370. That means that they've approved almost as many claims as children in care in 1977, and there's still 14 more years worth of policy and practice to go. This is from another deck with data from our 2016 census. About one half of foster children aged 0 to 4 are Aboriginal on the top row there, and but they only represent 7.7% of the overall population in that age category. This is one of the reasons why sometimes when I introduce myself, I also mention that I hold a dual citizenship with HACLIP as well as with the MCFD Nation. I think these were provincial numbers. So the representative for children and youth recently released this report on injury and death reports for First Nations and children and youth in BC from 2015 to 2017. This graphic here shows the reported injuries of children in care by Indigenous identity. It raises some questions for me anyway about how we're using the word care here. Suicide shows up. It's a heavy word, and it carries with it a tremendous weight. It's one of those words that describes a situation where you either have been touched by it or you haven't. And until you've been touched by it, you don't really know. You don't really know that. This is one of our publications. The different heights here indicate that there are some statistically significant differences in this data set. And of course, something to keep in mind as you look at it, is that this isn't just a data set, like these are numbers, but it's a lot more than numbers. These are all stories behind these numbers. It isn't all bad news from the report, as you can see there. But as positive as it can be in some places, and as positive as it could be, the fact remains for me at least that one is one too many. Um, I may be a little bit biased here, but I'm okay acknowledging that bias on the topic. So I'm a child of suicide. My Ukrainian father took his life when I was very young, and the weight of that incident, it hangs over you. It lives within you, whether you want it to or not, and whether you're aware of it or not. You're always somehow in its shadow. Pretending that it isn't there doesn't do you any good. And if you've seen what I've done right there, I've said a bunch of yous instead of I's. I've even started using some distancing language with words like incident or event. This dehumanizes it, and I'm committing violence when I do this. The words become perversions of the truth. They become perversions of the more accurate words that I've deliberately avoided. Now, I trade the human spirit for temporary comfort when I do this. I think it's about safety or maybe defense. But either way, whatever it is about, I like to think it's about taking care of myself when I talk about it. But again, that could just be me being an idiot. So my own personal ideations and from my experience were from when I was trying to be something I'm not, trying to become at the time what I would say fully un-Indian, as everyone seemed to expect from me. So I later understood through the process of internalization that I had expected that from myself. It's also a heavy burden to be raised as an Indian in a culture and a country that defines itself against your very identity, and a country that never wanted you to have been born, or at the very least wanted you to have been born differently or raised differently. And so at a certain point when you haven't figured out your identity yet, you aren't really living your true self, are you? You become more of a perversion of your true self. So there's a connection somewhere here between culture and suicide. And we've seen it in the RCY report. We've seen it in our publications. And my own personal disconnection from my culture is part of that larger story here. Now, that story began, or had one of its beginnings, with the goal in mind of killing the Indian and the child, of finding the final solution to the Indian problem. And the heart of this is culture, and the key for understanding it is children. So my birth mother, who my kids call Tummy Mummy, is an alumni of the Kamloops Industrial School. Those are her stories, not mine. But maybe I should say that they're not mine to share. But George Manuel wrote in The Fourth World that it was the kids coming back from the residential school who brought the generation gap with them. So I'm going to take a look at this word school here, because it's a really nice word, isn't it? But what does this word allow you to think, and what does it deny from you? So these were industrial schools. This isn't what we think of today when we say the word school. So I try not to refer to them as schools, because I think that is a perversion of both the truth of what happened and of the word itself. So it gives us comfort in situations where I think we should be uncomfortable. I've gone to different kinds of schools in my time. I've earned a couple sets of letters that I can throw behind my name if I want. And I got those from school. And exactly none of my experiences in all those years match any of my mom's at her school. So my children, to reframe it, my children go to school. I went to school. My mom didn't. There's a great section of The Fourth World where he repeats the phrase, that was industrial training. Now, George really emphasizes two things when he does this. One is that these were about industrial training, and two is that they weren't. For example, learning to steal from others and your own, industrial training. Hunger so strong it numbs your mind, industrial training. So this isn't even really about industrial training, is it? And that phrase itself has become more comfortable than the truth. So we're going to look at industrial training experiences here as stories. On the left is the number of people who submitted statements to the TRC process. In the middle is the total number of children who survived the industrial training. And then on the right is the number of survivors estimated to be alive at the time. So these are big numbers, but I'm going to sort of pervert this set for you to see if it changes anything for how we're viewing this. So the smallest large number in the previous screen is actually 8.4%. So it's 8.4% of stories available at the time, of stories of the industrial experience. If we add in all the stories that we'll never hear because people were dead at the time of the process, it's only about 4.5% of all individual stories. So is that a representative sample? How much is enough? Who gets to decide these things? But what about the stories connected to those stories? These stories don't just happen on their own without being connected to other people in their stories. So industrial training eventually led to this settlement agreement. And when you start to read it, it looks like everybody wants a really positive outcome. But there's that phrase that I mentioned, and it's really hard to begin healing if you still don't know who's responsible for what. So it's not really a surprise when you consider the foundation of where this all began, because everything comes from that foundation. So I'm going to talk about language again, but I'm going to talk briefly just about talking our languages. So more people are learning Aboriginal languages as a second language from 96 to 2016 there on the slide. We can keep track of second language acquisition with the census. Now, we already know it's tied to community and culture. And when we talk about this, I think it's also important to remember and to acknowledge that this is one of the things that industrial training was designed to eliminate. So I want to put Indian Act amendments and court cases beside some of these. See if there's a story here. The solid bars are the mother tongue speakers. The lines are the second language. So this is the snapshot from 2016. And you can count back, that means you can count back 20 years. And then you're at the last of the closures of the industrial training institutes. See if there's any noticeable changes, differences. I don't know that one causes the other. I don't know if they are in fact related, but for me, it's fascinating to be able to look at something like this and see if changes do or don't show up in the different data sets, and if there's something we can go further explore. So I'm not in that graph there showing the First Nations second language acquisition. I really wish I had a third thing that I could throw in for consistency there, but I don't. I'm not in the bars on the other slide either. On the third one back, I did it. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm still being a bit of an idiot here, but I can tell you that for the 2021 report, I won't be there yet. For 2026, though, I will be there, and so will my children. So perhaps industrial training held some of these things out of reach momentarily, but they failed overall, and I don't think that the plan worked. So if we consider the lived and the unlived lives and the significance of word choice, if I've done this right up until now, something I think and feel we need to honor is with the unlived lives, is the unlived lives that our communities never had the chance to have. These alternate timelines and fantasies, if you will, they can either haunt us or live with us. And how they drive us or exist within and amongst us is up to us. It's our individual and our collective responsibility. It's important to be honest about these unlived lives because some of them are unlived by choice, by policy, and at times by force. And so I think if you see the indicators in the data set and you see the different graphs, I normally will tell an audience to take the question home with them, what if this is everything going according to plan? But it doesn't have to be our plan, and it's not my plan or your plan. This isn't about guilt. It's more of an exercise in testing the boundaries of our ideas, our beliefs, and our perceptions. The reason I mention guilt is because I've learned in the Western world We use guilt both offensively and defensively whenever we get uncomfortable. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to finish where I began. You may have come to your own conclusions about why I'm an idiot. And my wife, Sarah, she has offered to contribute to this topic if anyone still has their doubts. But I am, after all, the idiot who told his mom, his white mom, that she had lived too long and made a chart to prove it. And now I'll tell you that that chart I made for my mom stopped growing a year ago. I told you that I'm not on that language chart yet, but I'm growing my way there. And as I keep my own chart growing of what I'll call reclaimed stolen years of life lost, I'm looking forward to adding a line that says something around a coming of age ceremony. And perhaps after that, some of the old people here will let me know I'm not so much of an idiot anymore. If you know where and how to look, I think you can see in our data a very powerful message, and that is that we have already survived. You and I have already survived. So the final message I have is the message I was going to deliver to the youth pre-COVID. And that is that we were here yesterday, we are here today, and we'll be here tomorrow. So thank you everybody for participating and for the hiccups. And here's my email.
Thank you so much, Brian. If you can, let's go ahead and stop screen sharing. Yes. Great. Thank you so much. I think everybody found that very, very interesting and informative. So please stop calling yourself an idiot. I think you know a lot. You're definitely not an idiot. But thank you so much for your presentation. The slide decks for every presenter today will be available afterwards. And this webinar is being recorded too as well, and will be available on the First Nations Public Service Secretariat YouTube channel too as well. So thank you again, Brian. Next up, we have Robert Harding, who's going to also present, and he is from the University of the Fraser Valley. So I'll go ahead and ask Robert to go ahead and start.
Yes, hello. I'm just trying to get my presentation, which has now disappeared up on the screen here. Just give me a moment. Okay, where we go. Okay, now that should. I apologize for this. I can't. Let's see. This might work. Eric,
Yes. So just.
Okay. Sorry. Well, I guess I've just proven that I'm an idiot. I don't need to say it. My name is Robert Harding, and I teach in the School of Social Work and Human Services at the University of the Fraser Valley. And I just like to start with this photo of the raven, which is a creature that has special significance in this province. And this photo was taken, and elsewhere actually, this photo was taken by a Finnish nature photographer, Eero Murtomäki, who's the Snow Change Elder in Residence. And that's over in Finland. The Snow Change Cooperative is an organization devoted to studying climate change and its impact on northern Indigenous peoples in Finland, Norway, Russia, and even in Canada. So I'll come back to that later. I just want to very quickly thank Byron, who's definitely not an idiot, for the invitation, because I'm really passionate about the kinds of stories that data can tell, and StatsCan represents a valuable resource for Indigenous researchers. So I'm really enthusiastic to help get the message out, and I'm honored to share the stage with Len Garis and Byron Flekke. And that was a fascinating presentation, Byron. And I want to thank everyone for coming here today and honoring the importance of the topic. I know it's not an easy time for anyone, and I appreciate your time. I also want to acknowledge that I'm on the territory of the Stalo peoples, who I work with every day at the university, and give my thanks for the opportunity for participating in this important work on Stalo land. So what is my role in research? At the university, I kind of have a dual role. I conduct my own research into poverty and social issues, And I also look at, I guess my main area of research is really looking at news coverage of issues related to Indigenous territory governance and child welfare. So that's the first role that I have. And then secondly, I try to facilitate my students to engage in research. And this mostly happens in 2 courses. We have recently implemented a BA program in Indigenous Studies, and one of the required courses is a research course, and this is Indigenous Peoples Knowledge 344, Indigenous Methodologies. And students in this course, they produce a full research proposal. And then the other course that I teach, in which this kind of work happens, is a little different, is social work and community development, where students engage in participatory action research projects and work in teams of 10 to 15 to implement projects in their communities. So the kind of work I do really is very similar to what the Maori researcher and educator Linda Tuohai Smith describes as reframing, critical rereading, and representing, essentially challenging the way that news media reports on Indigenous issues. And Dr. Smith wrote a groundbreaking book on research methodologies for Indigenous peoples a few years back. And if you haven't seen that, I think it's a great book. You might want to check that out. And so, yeah, so my work really is focused on challenging the news media, specifically calling out racism in the news. So I look at publications such as The Province, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and how they report on Indigenous issues. And essentially, it involves calling out the press for distortions, stereotyping, leaving out Indigenous sources. And something you see very often is the way that the media report on a land claim or something, is that there won't be much context or history provided, even though there's a long sort of history behind the story, and that really affects the public's ability to kind of understand the issue. And so I also focus on changing public opinion and educating non-Indigenous audiences, because there's a real need to educate settlers in this country, because they're not getting a good take on these issues in the media, and they're not receiving the education in public education. And I'm part of that, and I have to take responsibility for that at the university. So this is kind of an example, to give you one quick example of the type of work that I do. Even though this is a few years back, I think you see some of the same patterns today in the news media. So this was back in 2002 when City of Vancouver and Whistler were engaged in an application to hold the 2010 Olympics, Winter Olympics here in Vancouver. And some Indigenous people, some First Nations, were protesting because, based on the argument that there were all these social issues, income inequality, poverty, conditions on reserves that were unacceptable, people lacking access to good housing, water, treaty negotiations that have been stalled for many years. So the list goes on and on and on, of course. And so basically, Indigenous people, some First Nations, were protesting because they felt that, it was probably better to attend to some of these issues than have this big party, spend all this money on this big party in Vancouver and Whistler. And so this headline, 8 words, really represents some of the worst practices that you see in journalism. So I'll just give you a little bit of analysis here. So first of all, starting with the term natives, it really is a conflation. So there were some First Nations that protested, others didn't, others were indifferent and said, well, you can have your party, but don't ask us to get involved. And then there were also certain First Nations who collaborated and received some benefit from the Olympic bid, and the 4 host nations, of course. So really, it's saying all Indigenous people everywhere went to Europe to block our Olympic bid. And if you could just imagine, many, many dozens of cruise ships loaded with Indigenous people heading over to Europe. I mean, that's the image it conjures up. And secondly, even in 2002, in public discourse, most people were using the term Aboriginal rather than Native. So they kind of opted for a more, an older term. And one of the things we look at in this kind of work is verb use. And again, the editors opted to use a term that has a negative connotation, a verb that has a negative connotation. So the verb block means that you're trying to prevent someone from doing something that they think is positive, something they're trying to achieve. But I think the most egregious aspect of this headline is the polarization. So natives go to Europe to block our Olympic bid. And I had to scratch my head for some time to figure out who they were talking about. Who's our? It certainly doesn't include me. Does it include, are they talking about Indo-Canadians who live in the province, or Asian Canadians? Or are they only talking about white settlers? So it's kind of a divisive approach to reporting on the news that you see down in the United States, and that, a kind of polarization and racialization that Donald Trump was famous for. So again, this is from a few years back, but I've seen a number of the same problems in the media today and how they report on a variety of issues. So another area of research that I do is on poverty reduction. And so I co-wrote a chapter with another social worker in a book looking at poverty reduction strategies in Abbotsford and New Westminster. And it really wouldn't have been possible to write this chapter had we not had access to Statistics Canada data on population demographics, immigration, transportation. So for example, what percentage of the community uses private vehicles versus the public transport system, level of educational attainment, and most importantly, of course, income level. So the percentage of different segments of the population living in low income. And so Stats Canada is an incredible tool for people who are engaged in reducing poverty, because if you're going to make an argument to have the government implement certain policies and really deal with the issue, you have to show the scale of the problem. Now, the thing to bear in mind is the Statistics Canada doesn't actually use the term poverty. They use low income, and there are several different measures available to kind of gauge that. There's the low income measure, there's the market basket method. But nonetheless, it's very hard to engage in pressuring the government to deal with poverty if you can't demonstrate a strong numerical case for that, and that's something that they understand. And in terms of a valuable resource for Indigenous researchers, of course, we've had a number of royal commissions and inquiries on Indigenous peoples, including the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015, as well as the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Children. And so all of these commissions and inquiries drew heavily upon Statistics Canada to make a case for legal, social, and economic justice for Indigenous peoples. So it could be a great tool for educating settler Canadians and pressuring governments to address Indigenous concerns and create better policy. So this refers back to the first slide, Eero Murtamaki, the Elder in Residence for Snow Change. So the Snow Change Cooperative is based in Finland, but it operates internationally. And Dr. Taramo Stonen is a colleague of mine, and he is the founder of Snow Change. He's a passionate defender of traditional worldview and cosmology of his people, and head of the village of Selki in Finland. And so he works for Snow Change Cooperative, and their work really focuses on the impact of climate change in the north, which specifically affects Indigenous peoples in the north. And he has contacts throughout Northern Canada and British Columbia as well. And so he's a traditional fisherman and a researcher of Arctic biodiversity, climate change, and Indigenous issues. And he's published over a dozen books, including the groundbreaking Eastern Sami Atlas. The Eastern Sami are the Indigenous people in Finland. And he lives in the middle of an old growth forest in Selki with his wife Kaiser. And he fishes in the winter, and he's won a variety of awards for his work. And he also has a connection to a local First Nation on Vancouver Island. And yeah, if you want to contact him, I've included the link here to Snow Change. And he's the kind of guy who's very open. If you have a question or something you want to discuss related to climate change in your community, feel free to reach out to him. And I know Taro, and he would welcome that. So in terms of the research that I foster in my courses, in social work and community development, in that course, I encourage my students to get to know the community before they begin any work in the community. And so Statistics Canada is a really good way to become acquainted with your community through its community profiles. And so out of those projects, a number of interesting work has occurred, starting with one group a few years back that they looked to pressure the government to create a poverty reduction plan in British Columbia. This was under the Liberals. There was no poverty reduction plan in BC. And so they accessed a lot of statistics on low income and invited politicians and representatives from social service organizations to have a debate about it. And I'm not saying that they actually made it happen, but we do now have a poverty reduction plan in British Columbia. Another project involved creating a land acknowledgement video for the University of the Fraser Valley in collaboration with the Stalo Nation. And I've included a link here directly to YouTube if you want to check that out. So they did that working with the Indigenous subcommittee of Senate and working with Stephen Point, former Grand Chief of the Stalo Nation and Lieutenant Governor of the province, and his partner, Gwen Point, who was the former Chancellor of UFE. And another project was Stand Up, Stand Together. And this project, students worked on increasing the awareness for men to play a role in ending domestic violence. We know that women, of course, a lot of women have been responsible through their activism for making a lot of change, but men have kind of gotten off the hook for that. And so a really valuable project. And those all came out of that course. In terms of Indigenous Peoples Knowledge 344, Indigenous Methodologies, this is a course that is mostly taken by Indigenous students. And the final assignment is producing a research proposal. And there's some really interesting proposals that have come out of that course. So for example, what are the best Indigenous child welfare practices across the country? So kind of establishing best practices, drawing upon statistics on Indigenous child welfare, language revitalization programs in Canada and international settings, what works best. It's amazing what the Maori people in New Zealand are doing in that area. I went to a symposium a few years back at a marae in Auckland, and wow, literally there were hundreds of people there and not a word of English was spoken until the break, until we went back to the cafeteria. Incredible. Of course, I had to keep my mouth shut during that because I don't speak very much Maori. And then another project was looking at how applicable are harm reduction programs that we see a lot in the South and some of the larger population centers, but how applicable are those to Northern Indigenous communities? So I may have gone on too long and I apologize for that, but I will I'd like to highlight a couple of conclusions. I've had a lot of students and other people come up to me and talk about kind of the image that research has. And some Indigenous people understandably are suspicious of research due to the incredible harm caused by past settler research activities to Indigenous peoples, communities, and cultures. And the list is so long of kind of negative research or harmful research, and just starting with the nutritional experiments that were conducted in residential schools. And I mean, the list is endless. So it's understandable people would have trepidation whenever the term research is mentioned. But now I think it's a case of taking control of some of these resources that are available, such as Statistics Canada, so that research can be conducted in culturally appropriate ways so that the benefit is shared with local communities. And this is something that Byron Flekke has spoken to powerfully in his own presentations to my classes on topics of importance to Indigenous peoples, child welfare, traditional worldviews and conceptions of the land. So finally, research can be an education tool for settlers because it's essential that settler Canadians, especially newcomers, who may not know very much about Canada's history of colonialism, but they're able to access statistics and data about conditions and issues faced by Indigenous peoples as a result of historical and ongoing colonial practice. Sometimes in Canada, I think when you come to Canada, you think, well, that's, like as a newcomer, as an immigrant, well, that's just a historical artifact. That's not happening anymore. So, I mean, people need to be educated. And it's really important that settlers are not allowed to forget or erase Canada's colonial past and present, as our former Prime Minister did in 2009 at the G20 summit in Pittsburgh, when he said, we have no history of colonialism. And my friend Byron reminded me as well that our Prime Minister recently said something to the same effect, also in an international venue, something to the effect that, well, we don't have the same colonial past as some of the countries represented in this room. So, settlers can't be let off the hook. Settlers should never be allowed to erase the history of colonialism in this country. They have to be taken to task. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert, for that presentation. Sorry, if we can stop screen sharing. There we go. Perfect. Thank you so much for that. And again, the slide deck will be available afterwards. We will share it and let you know the recording is up and available too. I'd now like to call on Len Garis. You can turn on your video.
Thank you.
Yeah, over to you, Len.
I think you are going to...
Yes, I will pull it up right now. So just give me a shout when you want to go to the next slide.
Sure. So if you can just bring it up and get me started. So while you're doing that, my name is Len Garis, and I'm the Director of Research for the National Indigenous Fire Safety Council of Canada. And I just wanted to point out that in June of 2019, I retired after 35 years of experience with the Canadian Fire Services, and I was really proud to retire. At that point, a colleague of mine who I've known for a number of years, Blaine Wiggins, who's the Executive Director of the Aboriginal Firefighters Association of Canada, he called me and asked me if I would give him a hand in conducting some research around First Nations communities in Canada, and with a focus on helping their program, which stood up about 2 years ago. It's in its third year of operation, in order to provide programs and services for Indigenous people on First Nations communities in Canada. And I thought that was an interesting initiative, and I wasn't sure exactly what research was. And he said, well, how could you help us? What was your thoughts? And so I reflected back, and I realized that for most of my career, I've relied on data and measurements on help to guide me on how to make changes. And I found it to be quite successful in my career in Surrey. So the first place I looked was, where's the data? And unfortunately, what I found is that where Robert was speaking about in terms of 2009, I think it was just about 2010 or 11 when First Nations communities ceased collecting data. So the task ahead of me was to provide guidance for programs and services for nearly 700 communities in Canada on what's occurring in terms of fire safety. And so from that perspective, I found it very difficult. And so I launched a number of programs. One, the first thing I did is I looked at census data, and I looked at housing statistics in terms of on First Nations communities, which I was able to find. And I thought, well, the percentage of overcrowding and poor housing conditions is probably a factor that we really want to focus on. But I wanted to know where the death and injuries were, and I couldn't find them. So this work that you're about to see is how I was able to approach and determine the nature and the scope of fire-related injuries and fatalities in Canada on First Nations communities. And it's not a great story, but what I am encouraged about is that there is an organization in the National Indigenous Fire Safety Council that is focused specifically on making a difference on First Nations communities in Canada, and there's quite a difference. So next slide, please. So I would just want to acknowledge, I won't go through it entirely, but certainly the board of directors of the National Indigenous Fire Safety Council, which is made up of representations right across Canada for Indigenous peoples. And of course, I mentioned Blaine Wiggins, the executive director, who sought me out to help me, for me to help the organization going forward in terms of making decisions based on data. Next slide, please. And so what did we know before today? And this was before the report was published. We know that there was work done in British Columbia between 1991 and 2001. Basically, fire-related mortality in British Columbia was 9 times higher than the rest of the BC population. And that was a big warning signal that should resonate. Please remember that. In 2007 and 11, a similar study was occurred where they discovered that it was 4 times higher than non-Indigenous people. And then in 2007, the Canadian Housing and Mortgage Corporation did a study, and we had very difficult time finding the underlying data and what areas that it covered, but they did say it was 10.4 times more likely to die if you're Indigenous than a non-Indigenous person in Canada. Next slide, please. And so we leaned on Statistics Canada, and I'm echoing what Robert and Brian had to say about the importance of data and enumeration. Essentially what we did is in 2011, we were able to discover in the census data individuals that identified as Indigenous, and that was the baseline for this research. And then as every subsequent year went forward, we linked that information with hospitalization records and with vital statistics, meaning were you alive or not alive at the time? And if you weren't alive, what did you die from? Was it premature? And obviously our interest was fire related. And the same would be with hospitalizations. And these are acute hospitalizations, of course. And that didn't include Quebec because they don't allow themselves to be enumerated in the hospitalization database. Next slide, please. So basically what we were looking at is causes of mortality: fires, building structure fires and other fires, burns related to fires, non-fire related burns are important as well, and CO poisoning and fire related and non-fire related and unintentional non-fire related. Next slide, please. And the causes of hospitalization, fire-related injuries and burns, fire-related burns, non-fire-related burns, CO poisoning, fire-related and unintentional. Next slide, please. And so what do we know today? Well, it's not much different than 20 years ago, which was a great concern for me, being a fire service professional and saying, how is it possible that it's been 20 years and we're still seeing the same things occurring? So really we started out to say, if you're a First Nations individual in Canada, living anywhere in Canada, you're 5.3 times more likely to die in a fire than a non-Indigenous person. If you're Métis, it's 2 times. And if you're Inuit, it's 17.6 times more likely. Next slide. So the other thing that we did is we looked at fire-related mortality living on reserve in Canada, and that's a familiar number, 10.6. If you're anywhere in Canada, if you're just in Quebec, it's 8.5. Ontario's 10.3 and Alberta is 15.3. And you'll notice in British Columbia on the right-hand side, there's an F there, and there's no First Nations people that are being represented, and that's because the numbers are too low to report for privacy issues and identification. And in some cases, that's better news for British Columbia because it means that the death rates for that period of time were low enough that they were not reported. Doesn't mean that they didn't happen. It just means that they were lower to be counted. So next slide, please. So when we looked at fire-related mortality living on reserve, and we looked at the age groups, 25 to 44 were 9 times higher, 45 to 64 were 4, and ages 65 to 75 were too low to count. And I thought, how is that possible? When I look at the Canadian representation of non-Indigenous people and those who die within those age groups, they're overrepresented from every other age groups. So for example, if you're over 65 in Canada, you're non-Indigenous, you would represent about 30% of the deaths associated with fire in Canada. But yet in this particular case, they were too low to count. So I wanted to say, is that good news? But then when I looked at the census and I realized that 15% of the Canadian population is 65 or older. And then when I looked at a study that was done in 2020 that was released by Stats Canada, I realized that the representation of Indigenous individuals on reserve or off reserve were only 6 or 7% of the Canadian population. So I hypothesized by saying, well, you know, maybe they're just not living long enough to die in a fire. Those are my words, but that's what my hypothesis is. But it means I need to do a bit more work to find out why that is. Next slide, please. So fire-related mortality living in Canada, the rate ratios, if you're female, if both sexes are 4 times higher. If you're female, it was 3 times higher. If you're male, 2 times higher. Next slide, please. And burn-related mortality, those are non-fire related burns, non-structure fire related burns, but both sexes were 5 times. If you're female, it was 8 times higher. And if you're male, it was 4.3 times higher. Next slide. So carbon monoxide related mortality living in Canada, the ratios are very similar across the board. And in some cases, non-Indigenous may be a little bit higher than Indigenous. And I'm not saying that this is good news, but it's not what I expected. I would expect that, you know, CO poisoning may be more predominant in remote communities that are using fireplaces, stoves, and those types of things, but it wasn't the case. So it was something that I expected to be higher, but is similar, but any CO poisoning death is too many. And why is that important to understand that? Well, as we're fitting smoke alarms, the technology allows us now to use combination devices that are both smoke detectors and carbon monoxide, and that should be what we're installing in order to guard against, to provide early warning for individuals living in homes to escape. Next slide, please. So hospitalization rates due to fire-related injuries in Canada, the rate ratios, once again, are much higher. First Nations are 4.4, Métis is 1.6 times higher, and Inuit is 5.1. And next slide, please. And if we look across the provinces, in Canada, it's 4.1 times higher for fire-related injuries. And these are acute injuries. If in the Atlantic provinces, it's 6 times, Manitoba 4.2, Saskatchewan 2.75, Alberta 3.4, and British Columbia 4.65 higher, which is considerably higher, which is something that I think most of the group that are watching today are from British Columbia, and this would be an area of concern in terms of the number of hospitalizations associated to burns. Next slide. So hospitalization for all burn-related injuries, and this is whether it's fire-related or whether it's scalds or other related types of burns. First Nations in Canada would be 3.2 times higher, Métis is 3.1, and Inuit is 1.16 times higher. Next slide. Oh, so now getting to the conclusion, and I think this is really important, is that there's no doubt about it. It's what we knew before, and before it was 20 years ago, and what we know today is pretty much the same problem. But what is different about it today is that the First Nations Aboriginal Firefighters Association of Canada were successful in getting funding, new money, in order to stand up a program and services to try and address these issues. You know, providing fire stations and fire trucks is important for communities, but all of the soft types of programs and understanding how First Nations individuals can interact with colonial structures and areas and environments that they're living in, and to do that safely and how they interconnect, I think will make a difference. I'm certain of that. And I know what I've told you here today is concerning and challenging, but you know, the Fire Safety Council, as I had indicated, has just set up nearly 100 programs and services, and they're available to nearly 700 communities in Canada. COVID has not been their friend in terms of the ability to visit communities and interact with bands and councils and community members in order to detail what types of programs are available. But once we get past this, and I know we're going to get past it soon, I'm expecting that as we go forward, we're going to see sharp declines in what's happening, and I'm looking forward to that. The next stage is now we know what is happening and the gravity of what's happening and how long it's been happening. The next thing we need to do is understand the why. So we're hoping to get some funding for access to coroner's database to understand the circumstances in which the deaths occurred. And we look forward to whoever's listening to this program and maybe researching a little bit deeper into what's available from the National Indigenous Fire Safety Council, what types of programs are available, and that can be offered in your communities. And as I said before, as a fire service professional, this is just not acceptable what we're seeing. But I also am incredibly encouraged that the government has funded a great program, and it will be coming to an end at the end of this fiscal year, but we're expecting that it's going to receive funding for the future. I professionally would anticipate it'll take 8 to 10 years to make this difference that we're looking for. And but this is a beginning, and I thank you for your time and opportunity to present here. And I'm looking forward to hearing any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Len, and all of our panelists for speaking today. We do have, just one question. I guess somebody answered one of the other questions. We have about 20 minutes to answer any questions, so please use the Q&A dialog box to type in your question. And if I could have the other panelists turn on their video too as well. I'm going to go ahead and read out this first one, but I encourage you, we have about 89 people in the webinar right now. Please type in your questions. You have 3 folks here that are a wealth of information. I encourage you to ask some questions. So the first question is from Ernest Armand. Hi, Ernest. I actually know you. Good to hear from you. He asks, how can this research be conducted for each tribe/nation? There are opportunities for every community in BC to engage to establish a comprehensive 10-year health and wellness plan. As part of this planning is the need for implementation and evaluation that needs strong, informed baseline data. So how can this research be conducted for each tribe and nation? And I will let all three of you, whoever wants to jump in, completely okay with me.
I can start just quickly from from a perspective. So I'm currently a field operations manager with the Census team out here in Pacific. And when Census is over, I return to my role as a liaison within the province. And so that position is part of what's called the Center for Indigenous Statistics and Partnerships. And what we do is we support capacity development and initiatives with Indigenous communities and organizations. And so I know for things that happen with StatsCan, you know, I can't speak on behalf of them entirely. I can only speak about myself or my role. And even then, maybe don't trust me because I am a bit of an idiot about it. But the census would be the baseline for kind of everything we do. And I don't know this question, it depends a lot on the either individual community or the nation and what's available on our end that we can contribute to, as well as offering capacity initiative workshops and things like that to support the community's own efforts that don't involve us. They're just based solely on using, understanding, collecting, and interpreting and analyzing and all those things to do with data. So both of the questions, though, I'm going to copy them and send them to my colleagues back home at the center, and then we can be in touch to follow up to talk about them. So I'll stop now. Thanks.
Great, thanks.
So
go ahead, Len.
Building on what Byron had to say, and is in terms of influencing policy, we need data, and all of our decision making now is based on data, and it's data for good, I'd like to say. And the work that I have been involved in so far has been, and trying to get access to it has been quite successful. Previous studies that I've done using census data, there's about 50 or 60 communities that did not want to participate in census. That becomes difficult for us to help us create robust decisions. Although we have 650 communities, it's more than enough to make good decisions, but I still wonder about those 50 and if we're missing those. And so hoping that people will understand the importance of being counted and participating in that, and recognizing that at least for our organization, that is its policy and its vision is for us, by us. So for First Nations, by First Nations. I think we're going to see some changes and some improvements, but if we don't have the information, it's going to be very difficult to answer the questions.
Thank you. There is a question in the group chat too as well from Matthew. It says, can you point to examples of where data has affected policy for good? Again, and any one of you, feel free to jump in.
Well, I would like to point out in 2011 and 2012, a smoke alarm initiative occurred in British Columbia that included First Nations communities as well. And over that period of time, 4 or 5 years of focusing on that policy of trying to update and recognize the value of smoke alarms in British Columbia, saw a 50% decrease in the number of deaths, both on Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities in British Columbia. That made a huge difference. And we're starting to see a resurgence of fatal fires, both in Indigenous and non-Indigenous in British Columbia. And I believe it's because those 10 years ago, those smoke alarms were installed and were fresh, and now they're expiring and maybe not functioning in those circumstances. And so here's an example of how, one area, understanding the circumstances and the changes and what it can do. And then I would say what is happening is we didn't realize that we need to maintain those programs. They're like seatbelts. They're like giving vaccinations. Once you start, you cannot stop. So that's something that I think we need to focus on. And there's other great examples, I'm sure, that Byron or Robert could probably attest to.
Thanks, Len. Robert, did you want to add anything?
Well, I guess I'm thinking about a great question that Jeff posed earlier, and like the whole notion of it's Stats Canada came out of a colonial institution. I mean, you just can't avoid that, right? The way I look at it is we need to use every tool we have at our disposal. And I believe this firmly, that you can make a very strong case in many areas that the federal government, provincial governments have fallen down so badly in terms of meeting the needs of Indigenous people, simply by relying on Stats Can data. As my friend Eldon Yellowhorn, who's former director of First Nation Studies at Simon Fraser University, said to me when we were talking about this book that I was talking about earlier, Linda Smith's book about decolonizing methodologies, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are things, there is data that Stats Canada houses that can be very useful to making a case for, a transformative responses to a lot of these issues. And Eldon talks about colonizing the colonizer, right? And I think that's one of the ways you can do it. In the same way that the work I do, most of the work I do doesn't involve Stats Can data, but I have used it from time to time, but most of it involves studying the dominant media, corporate media, because there are all these publications we're talking about, they're all owned by corporations. And, so I study the media because I think that's where a lot of the influence is, right? And that has to be challenged, right? So right now, I've got a major project looking at how corporate media, the Globe and Mail, National Post, cover petroleum exploration activities on Indigenous territory. How do they cover them? And then I'm also comparing that with how those issues are covered in Indigenous media, in Indigenous news outlets, which of course are smaller and publish less frequently and less volume of news. But that research, the result of that research, so basically studying what the man is saying, what the colonizer is saying in the mainstream press, and challenging that, and looking at the Indigenous media and saying, this is what's possible. There's a whole different way of seeing these issues possible. I think that has value. So in the same way, I think that Stats Can absolutely is a colonial institution, right? But I think it can be used to the advantage. I believe that strongly. And so basically, at the end of the day, it's their own data that's condemning them. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but that's my feeling.
Thanks so much, Robert. Your video seems to be freezing, but we did hear everything that you said. So there was a couple other questions too as well. Thank you, Jeff. He actually shared his contact information and would very much like to chat with our panelists here today. There's a question here that says, where can First Nations get training or support on using data to tell a story effectively? For example, to show Chief and Council or a report to membership. And Jeff actually shared a link to as well. And there's also another link that Jeff shared for other data governance nerds. Here's another great resource. So thank you for sharing that, much appreciated, but also over to our panelists if you have any other options for training potentially that First Nations could take.
On our end, we do through the Center for Indigenous Statistics and Partnerships do offer training, and we can get a list of what we have available that's being worked on. And they're working on more, but I haven't been a part of that for a few months, so I'm not as up to date as I could be. But I can find out and see what we have to offer from our side that you could use, that you could benefit from. And then if we have any other resources that aren't ours, I always share whatever I come across and find, because the more the merrier, sort of as far as I'm concerned.
Len or Robert, anything to add to that?
So somehow I got cut off. I'm not sure how much of my rant was.
No, we heard everything. Your video did freeze, but we continued to hear everything you said.
Okay.
So it's fine.
Then it just disappeared, and I thought, uh-oh,
No,
I better not rail against Stats Canada or I'll get cut off. No, I have nothing to add. I think I probably went on too long as it was.
No worries.
No, I'm fine, thank you. I'm fine, thank you.
All right. This is just a comment from Russell. Colonialism is present, yet today we are restricted in our own lands and resources. We need licenses given from colonizers to hunt, to fish, to harvest trees for traditional use, to build homes. Even as a treaty nation, we still have limits set by the government of Canada. They give us the illusion that we are independent, but just a comment, I wanted to just make that aware to everyone here listening today. So thank you so much for your comment, much appreciated. I also want to bring your attention to the group chat. Len Garis, who works with the First Nations Public Service Secretariat, has been hiding out in the background and posting some comments. We do have an evaluation survey that will pop up after this webinar, but please fill it out. It helps us determine and plan future webinars just like this. So greatly appreciate it if you could fill it out and let us know if we're doing good things. The other thing she shared about was the First Nations Information Governance Center, which was talked about and referenced by Jeff and Helen in the group chat. They are collaborating to deliver 20 regional engagement sessions with Indigenous leadership across British Columbia in late April through May to determine the next steps in implementing the First Nation data governance strategy. So for more information, you can contact fndgs@fnps.ca to learn a little bit more about that too as well. And Brian also shared his email. Contact information for our panelists is available to everyone too as well. We have about 5 more minutes if, oh wait, are there more questions coming into the chat? All right. Robin asks, where else can we find data when StatsCan has nothing on a particular First Nation? Is there a comprehensive database? Brian, Len, or Robert?
I think just kind of off the top of my head, it depends on what we're looking for and the community involved. If we don't have it, then I don't really know where we would be able to get that. But we could also know some other resources depending on the topic and all that. So for BC, it's 203 to 206 unique questions, but we're always open for trying to troubleshoot that on our end. And then we do have the other great resources that are being listed. I thought I would just mention that one off the top of my head.
Thank you. Just one final comment or question. Lorena says, my daughter, and I'm sorry if I say the name wrong, Talais Seymour had done a presentation for Orange Shirt Day this year that she was compelled to present to her high school. It gave a view in a nutshell to the issues that Native people still face today due to the generational impacts residential schools have left behind. Feel free to look it up. And apparently it's on YouTube if you just search Talais Seymour. Hi, the recording won't be available until most likely tomorrow or the next day. It takes a couple hours to load and then we edit and upload. So it won't be ready by today, but we can definitely share it with everyone who registered once it is ready and publicly available. Matthew asked for OCAP. Possession is a big issue. Where can data be stored in Canada to achieve the possession issue when data is stored in US servers? Not sure if anyone can really speak to that, but go ahead. Robert, you're just shaking your head, I guess. It's a big.
Another reverberation of the Patriots Act. I mean, yeah, it's so frustrating. And, you know, it's funny, all of the a lot of the tools that we use at UFV, you know, come down to data that's stored on US servers, right? So there's always that risk, right? And I think that's, you know, for Indigenous people, that whole idea that I think it was Jeff Hackett mentioned about data sovereignty. That's where it becomes really important, you know. I don't really have much more to say than that, but I mean, that's such an important thing, you know, and I can understand from that perspective why Indigenous people would be concerned about Stats Canada owning this data, because then what happens to it? Because we don't have control of it. Anyway, sorry, not much of a response, but.
That's quite all right. So 3 more minutes left in our webinar. A lot of thank yous in our group chat today. Everyone is very appreciative of this webinar and everything that you had to share. So again, I want to thank all 3 of our panelists here today. I think we're just going to go ahead and wrap up for this afternoon, and please subscribe to our email newsletter to stay up to date on future webinars. If you go to our website at fnps.ca, you can check out a lot more and learn a lot more about what we do here at the First Nations Public Service Secretariat, but also to subscribe to our email newsletter to make sure that you are joining us on future webinars, training, and all the other good stuff we're doing over here. So again, shout out to all of our panelists. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Go have some lunch, go enjoy the sun, and stay healthy and safe out there. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.